There is a room that does not appear on any building map. No sign marks its door. No window faces the outside world. The air inside is recycled clean, cold, and utterly still, like the inside of a sealed coffin. The only light comes from a row of monitors and the soft blue glow of a glass partition that stretches from floor to ceiling. On one side of that glass, scientists, men and women in white coats, clipboards pressed to their chests, eyes fixed on screens, on data, on numbers that represent something they are not entirely sure they understand. They speak in low voices. They avoid looking directly through the glass for too long, because on the other side is a girl. She sits in a chair upright, unnervingly still, her hands resting flat on her thighs, her eyes open, staring at nothing. Or perhaps staring at everything. It is impossible to tell. She does not blink at the normal intervals. She does not shift her weight. She does not tap her fingers or exhale through her mouth the way all humans do when they are simply waiting. She's not simply waiting. She is listening, processing. Behind those still, dark eyes, something is running calculations, assessments, threat matrices built from data points none of us would notice. The way a researcher scratched the back of his neck, the micro tremble in a scientist's voice when she said the word ready, the 2mm deviation in the positioning of a chair that told her someone had been in this room before the scheduled time. She noticed all of it. She said nothing. No pulse spike, said the lead researcher, a man named Dr. Kessler, though that name will matter little to what comes next. He was looking at a biometric readout, his voice carrying the carefully neutral tone of a man who had trained himself not to feel wonder. No hesitation, no observable anxiety response whatsoever. He paused. She's perfect. The woman standing beside him, younger, quieter, with shadows under her eyes that had been there for 3 weeks straight, turned her gaze from the readout to the glass, to the girl. She's not perfect, she said. Her voice was soft, careful, as though the words might break something. She's human. Kessler made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He turned back to his screen. Not anymore. You need to understand something before we go further. This is not a story about artificial intelligence. It is not a story about science gone wrong, or government overreach, or the cold machinery of military ambition, though all of those things are present here, woven into the fabric of what happened like wires through concrete. This is a story about a human being, a real one. Her name is Maya. She was 17 years old when she was brought to that room. She had a favorite song she used to hum when she thought no one was listening. She had a habit of folding the corners of paper when she was nervous. She had, once, a life that looked like other lives, ordinary and imperfect, and hers. What was done to her is documented, recorded, buried in files that were never meant to be opened, in a facility that was never meant to be found. This is the story of what those files contain, and the story of the man who is, at this very moment, running toward her because he knows what activate her means. He knows what she has been told to do, and he knows, with the particular desperation of someone who has already lost everything once, that there is only one thing in this world that might still reach her: memory. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Go back. Go back to the beginning, before the glass, before the chair, before the cold blue light. Go back to a Thursday evening in autumn when a 17-year-old girl named Maya sat on a fire escape 3 floors above a street in a city she had lived in her entire life, watching the traffic below with the particular melancholy of someone who feels the world is happening just slightly out of reach. She did not know that evening that someone was watching her. She did not know that her life had already been chosen. She did not know that in 6 weeks she would be gone, and that the people who loved her would be told she had simply left. And they would believe it. Because that is what the file said, and the file is always the last word. Her test scores were extraordinary. That was the first thing they noticed. Not her face, not her background, not the particular tragedy of her early years that might have made her, in certain clinical assessments, more malleable. No. The first thing was the scores. a cognitive profile that emerged from a standardized school assessment and landed weeks later on a desk in a building that has no public-facing address. The analyst who reviewed it flagged it within 4 minutes. "Pattern recognition is off the charts," she told her supervisor, sliding the tablet across the desk. "Reaction latency is 40% below the mean. And look at this," she pointed to a section most people would have skimmed past. Her emotional dampening scores. When presented with high-stress stimuli, her cortisol response is minimal, almost non-existent. Her supervisor looked at the name at the top of the file. "How old?" 17. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Put her on the list." Maya did not know about lists. She knew about homework and the bus schedule, and the way her friend Danny laughed too loudly at her own jokes, and how that specific laugh was one of the best sounds she had ever heard. She knew the walk from her apartment to the library took 11 minutes if you didn't stop at the corner store, 9 if you cut through the parking garage. Though her mother had told her never to cut through the parking garage, she knew her mother's voice when it was tired. She knew her own voice when it was pretending not to be scared. She knew none of the things that were about to matter. The recruiter who approached her was not wearing a uniform. This was deliberate. He was a man who looked like a guidance counselor, kind face, patient eyes, the practiced warmth of someone whose job is to make you feel understood. He came to her school on a Tuesday. He sat across from her in a conference room with a glass of water that he didn't drink and a folder that he placed on the table between them but did not open. "We have a program," he said. "It's competitive. Exceptional candidates only. The skills you develop, focus, precision, decision-making under pressure. These aren't just professional assets. They're life-changing." He smiled. "We think you're exceptional, Maya." The program was real. The training was real. What they did not tell her, what they could not tell her, because she would not have come, was that the program had 2 phases. The first phase looked like what he described: physical conditioning, cognitive training, language modules, scenario simulations. Grueling, yes, but recognizable. Human. The second phase had never been done before, not at this scale, not with a subject this young. They needed someone whose neural architecture was still plastic enough to accept the modifications. Someone whose emotional responses could be redirected without the deep-rooted resistance that comes with age. Someone whose profile suggested a natural capacity for compartmentalization. They needed someone who would not break. They needed Maya. She said yes to the program on a Wednesday. She told her mother it was a scholarship opportunity. A residential program, intensive 6 months. She told Danny she'd text every day. She packed a bag that night, carefully, folding each item the way her mother had taught her. And she sat on the edge of her bed afterward and looked around her room with the strange, specific attention of someone who senses, without being able to name it, that something is ending. She left on a Friday morning. The texts to Danny stopped after 2 weeks. Her file noted this as successful transition to protocol. The protocol did not include contact with prior social connections. The protocol did not include a lot of things. There was a man on the program's oversight team who read that notation, successful transition to protocol, and felt something shift uncomfortably behind his ribs. His name was Dr. Elias Van. He had a background in cognitive neuroscience and a history of asking the wrong questions at the right times. He printed the notation. He put it in a drawer. He did not yet know what he was going to do with it, but he kept it. And that small act, the keeping of a piece of paper, is the reason this story exists. Remember that. Because in the stories we never hear, it is always the smallest acts that carry the most weight, not the grand gestures, not the dramatic confrontations. The piece of paper in a drawer, the name remembered, the one person in a room full of people who decides that the discomfort behind their ribs is worth paying attention to. Dr. Van paid attention, eventually, but first Maya had to go through the glass. Phase 2 began on a Monday. Maya had been in the facility for 43 days. She was, by every observable metric, doing well. Her performance benchmarks exceeded projections. Her instructors described her in their weekly reports using words like disciplined, focused, remarkably self-contained. She slept the exact hours the schedule allowed. She ate what was provided. She completed every task assigned to her with the quiet efficiency of someone who has decided that efficiency is the safest form of survival. None of them wrote down what she was actually doing. She was mapping the facility, cataloging every face, every routine, every deviation from routine. She was learning the hierarchy of the place, not from any briefing, but from the way people moved around each other, who held doors, who was greeted first, who was never left alone in a room. She was storing all of it without knowing exactly why, in the same way that a body stores a certain kind of cold, deep, and for a long time. She had also noticed Dr. Van. He was the only one who looked at her differently, not with the clinical detachment of the assessors or the careful blankness of the instructors. When he looked at her, it was with the expression of someone trying to solve an equation they're afraid of the answer to. She noticed. She filed it away. She said nothing. Phase 2 was, in the language of the project's internal documentation, described as neural optimization. This phrase is doing considerable work. What it actually meant was a combination of pharmacological intervention, directed conditioning, and what the lead researcher called in a presentation that was classified before it was finished being delivered, selective emotional architecture restructuring. In simpler terms, they were rebuilding the way she felt things. Not removing emotion that they had found was both impossible and counterproductive. A subject with no emotional response makes poor decisions under pressure. The amygdala, it turns out, is not an obstacle to precision. It is a component of it. What they wanted was something more sophisticated. They wanted fear that was useful, loyalty that was absolute, decisiveness unclouded by doubt. They wanted the parts of Maya that had been shaped by 17 years of living, the tenderness, the hesitation, the memories that made her who she was to be moved, like furniture in a room being repurposed, not destroyed, just relocated, put somewhere out of the way, inaccessible, or so they believed. The sessions took place in a room adjacent to the one with the glass. Maya was not restrained, had been found in earlier iterations of the protocol to produce an adversarial response that complicated the process. She was seated, comfortable, given something warm to hold, and the sessions were conducted in a tone so clinical, and even that the first few times, she thought they were simply evaluations. By the time she understood they were something else, the understanding itself had been smoothed. That is the most precise word for what happened to her over those weeks. The jagged edges of her, the specific grief, the specific joy, the specific voice of her mother calling her name in the way only her mother called it were smoothed, filed down, not gone, not destroyed, but no longer in the immediate sense reachable. She sat in that room. She answered questions. She completed simulations. She did not cry when, in one session, they showed her a photograph of her mother's face. She looked at it with the detached recognition of someone identifying a stranger in a photograph they have been shown before. The biometric readout showed no pulse spike. "No hesitation," said Dr. R. Kessler. "She's perfect." And that night, Dr. Van sat in his office for 2 hours without turning on the light. He had taken the job because he believed in the possibility of enhancement, the idea that human capacity for resilience, for focus, for survival could be augmented. He was not, he had told himself, naive about what the program's ultimate purpose was. But there is a difference between knowing a thing abstractly and watching it happen to a specific 17-year-old girl who, 6 weeks ago, was caught humming quietly to herself while completing a reaction time exercise. He had noted in his personal log, not the official one. She hums. Low, tuneless from a distance, but not actually tuneless. A real melody. Popular. A song someone her age would know from a shared playlist or a road trip or a friend's apartment on a rainy afternoon. She stopped humming 3 weeks into phase 2. He opened the drawer. He looked at the piece of paper. He thought about the word protocol. He thought about the photograph of her mother's face and the biometric readout with no pulse spike. He began that night to make a different kind of record, not because he had a plan yet, but because some part of him had decided, quietly and without fanfare, that what was happening in that facility was something that should not be allowed to disappear into classified silence. And if it could not be stopped from the inside, then someone on the outside would need to know. His phone landed face down on the kitchen floor. He didn't reach for it. He was already moving coat from the hook by the door, keys from the bowl on the counter, the particular muscle memory speed of a man who was rehearsed for a moment he prayed would never come. He had a bag packed and ready for 8 months. He checked it every Sunday the way other people check the weather. He had made himself ready because being ready was the only form of hope he could still afford. His name was Elias Van. He was 41 years old. He had a daughter whose drawings were pinned above his desk, and a habit of arriving 20 minutes early to everything, and a conscience that had cost him 2 jobs, 1 marriage, and as of tonight, quite possibly his freedom. He had left the facility 10 months ago after filing a report that was reviewed, assessed, and quietly closed. He had been told, in the careful language of institutional management, that his concerns were noted, that the protocols were within ethical parameters, and that his continued association with the project was no longer required. He was not fooled by the politeness. He knew what no longer required meant. He knew they would monitor him. He knew they would wait to see if he was going to be a problem. He had spent 10 months being carefully and visibly not a problem, while in the margins of that performance, he assembled everything he had. The records he'd kept, the photographs of documents taken on a device he'd bought with cash and kept behind a wall panel in his bathroom, the testimony of 2 other people who had left the program quietly and were, like him, waiting for something to change, or for the courage to make it change. And then, tonight, a message from the 3rd person, a technician named Reyes, who had never wanted to know as much as she knew, and who had stayed inside the facility longer than any of them because she believed she could limit the damage from within. The message was 3 words. They activated her. Van sat in his car for 45 seconds, the exact amount of time he had found that his nervous system needed to move from panic to function, and then he drove. He drove toward the city, toward the address that Reyes had identified 3 weeks ago, in a communication so carefully coded that even now he wasn't completely certain he'd read it right. A secondary location, not the original facility, but a place they had moved Maya to after his departure. A place the oversight file described simply as operational staging. He knew what that meant too. She was no longer a subject being processed. She was an instrument being deployed. They had not built a machine. Machines are predictable. Machines do exactly what they are told, within exactly the parameters they are given, and when they encounter something outside those parameters, they stop. What they had built was something more dangerous and more fragile than a machine. They had built a human being whose access to her own humanity had been systematically blocked. All the love and fear and memory and meaning that make a person still there, still intact, still running somewhere deep and unreachable in the architecture of who she was, simply walled off. Like a room in a house that has been sealed and painted over, so that from the outside you cannot tell there is a room there at all. But the room is still there, and if you know where to knock, Van's hands were steady on the wheel. He was thinking about a Thursday afternoon 14 months ago in the first phase of the program, before phase 2 began. He had been conducting a standard cognitive assessment reaction time pattern completion. Verbal sequencing, and Maya had answered every question with the focused efficiency that was already becoming her signature. And then, at the end of the session, out of nowhere, she had said, "Dr. Van, do you have kids?" He had looked up from his tablet. She was watching him with that direct, unnerving attention she turned on everything. "A daughter?" he said. "She's 8. Maya nodded slowly. "Does she know you do this?" "She knows I work in research, but not what the research is." He hadn't answered, and Maya hadn't pushed. She had simply looked at him for another moment and then looked away. And the session had ended, and he had driven home that evening thinking about his daughter, about the drawings pinned above his desk, about the difference between what we do and what we tell the people we love about what we do. That was the moment he understood now. That was when she had stopped being a file number and started being a person he was responsible for. The person in the passenger seat spoke for the first time since they'd gotten in the car. "If she remembers you, she'll stop." Van said nothing. "Elias," the voice was quiet, careful. "And if she doesn't?" He stared at the road ahead, the city lights growing closer, spreading across the windshield like something being activated. He didn't answer, because the answer was the kind of thing you cannot say out loud and then continue driving toward. The kind of answer that, once spoken, becomes real in a way it wasn't before. So he kept it inside. He kept driving. He kept his hands steady. And somewhere in the city ahead of him, in a room that appeared on no building map, a girl with still dark eyes and a sealed-off memory and a single word of instruction running through her like a current stood up. She moved through the city the way water moves, finding the path of least resistance, adapting to the shape of the space around her, leaving no visible trace. The streets were not empty, but she was invisible in them in the way that very still things are invisible because the eye moves toward motion. And she had mastered the art of being exactly as conspicuous as her surroundings required. She had a target. She had a route. She had a timeline built from variables she updated continuously as she moved the crowd density at each intersection, the positioning of cameras, the delay patterns of traffic signals on this particular grid. She did not have doubt. Doubt, in the architecture they had built inside her, was not a room with a sealed door. Doubt had been more thoroughly addressed. Doubt was the thing they were most afraid of, because doubt is the crack through which everything else returns. Or so they had believed. She was 3 blocks from the target location when it happened. Not a memory, not yet something smaller. A sensation, the kind that has no name because it predates language, predates thought, predates everything except the body and its insistent, unreasonable need to feel. A warmth behind her sternum that the cold air and the focused clarity of her current state had no explanation for. She did not stop walking. Her pace did not change, but something had shifted by a degree so small it would not have shown on any monitor. The kind of shift that happens not in the brain but below it in the old wordless parts that remember things the mind has been instructed to forget. She rounded a corner, and there was a man standing in the middle of the pavement, looking at her. He was not in a fighting stance. He was not holding anything. He was standing with his hands visible at his sides, deliberately, consciously visible, and he was looking at her with the expression of someone who is prepared to be wrong about everything and is still standing there anyway. Maya stopped, 4 meters between them. The street was quiet. Somewhere above them, a window was lit. A television playing something laughter, distant, from another world. She assessed him. The assessment took less than 2 seconds and produced a result that her training had not prepared her for. She knew this face, not as a threat, not as a target. The recognition was different. Older, it came from the part of her that had been smoothed down and relocated and told to be quiet. That part was no longer quiet. "Maya," he said. He said it simply, not as a command and not as a question. The way you say a name, when the name itself is the whole message. She said nothing, but she did not move toward the target. "I know what they told you," Van said. His voice was calm, the deliberate calm of someone who is very afraid and has decided that fear is not useful right now. "I know what he's been instructed to do. I know you don't. I know it's hard to access why that might be wrong." He paused. "I'm not asking you to know why. I'm asking you to remember something." She watched him. 14 months ago, he said. "You asked me about my daughter. You asked if she knew what the research was, and I didn't answer." His voice was very quiet now. "I didn't answer because I was ashamed, because I already knew then that what we were doing was wrong and I didn't stop it. And I am so sorry, Maya. I am sorry I didn't stop it sooner." Something moved across her face. It was not an expression that her program recognized or had a category for. It was the particular movement of a human face in the moment before something sealed begins to unseal, not breaking, not shattering, but the first infinitesimal shift of something returning to a place it was always meant to be. She breathed in, out. Her hands, which had been still at her sides the whole time, moved. Not toward him, just moved. The way hands move when a person is feeling something, and the feeling needs somewhere to go. She folded the corner of her sleeve. Van saw it. His throat moved. "There's a song," he said, barely above a whisper. "You used to hum it. In sessions, before phase 2. I wrote it down because I thought if I could find you again, maybe." He stopped. He started again. "Do you remember it?" The city was very quiet. And then, from somewhere inside the sealed-off room that was still Maya, still entirely and irreducibly herself, a sound, low, tuneless from a distance, but not actually tuneless, a real melody. The kind you learn from a playlist or a road trip or a friend's apartment on a rainy afternoon, the kind that exists in the body long after the mind has been told to forget. She was humming. She did not complete the mission that night. What happened next, the extraction, the testimony, the long and difficult process of undoing what had been done, is documented. It is real. It is, in its way, hopeful, though the word hopeful does insufficient justice to the cost of what it took to arrive there. But this is where we end this particular chapter. Not at the resolution, not at the aftermath, here at this precise and luminous moment on a quiet street when a song surfaced from somewhere it had been told not to be, and a girl who had been told she was no longer human proved, with a single melody, that she was, that she had always been. Memory does not relocate, it hides, and when the right voice calls it, it comes home.